Hi, my name is Grace Lockrobin. I'm a philosopher working in the community and in academia, where I'm a PhD student at UCL Institute of Education and also a teaching fellow at the University of Leeds. In the community for over 10 years, I've been the director of a non-profit that does public philosophy. And as part of that role, I've been a defender of philosophy in schools. In the past few years, and particularly in the past few months, I felt the need to defend my position on the value of philosophical education. And I want in this talk to make the case, which might be counterintuitive for some, that in a time of crisis, we actually need philosophy in schools now. I'm going to share my slides with you, so just bear with me. Okay, here we go. The name of my talk is Philosophy in a Time of Crisis. So before the pandemic hit, the crisis on everyone's lips concerned the climate and ecological disaster that's still unfolding. Though it might seem like a lifetime ago, it was only last year that thousands of young people went on strike from school to protest against the inaction of adults in the face of that emergency, while schools wondered what an appropriate educational response to this anger and activism might look like. Back then, there were no daily death tolls delivered at grim press conferences, but most of us didn't need to look far for news of the floods, wildfires, drought, biodiversity loss, species extinction, mass migration, and political instability that await us if we fail to decarbonise. As an educator, a citizen, a parent, as well as a scholar of education, I often thought about how frightening it must be for young people to face up to this kind of radical uncertainty about their future. I wondered how equipped they felt by their education. I was also aware through my professional networks that many teachers were anxious too, and understandably so, because they face the task of preparing their students to avert, or failing that, to adapt to this future. On just about any account of the aims of education, from the production of knowledge, the formation of character, the strengthening of democracy, the growth of the economy, even the survival of the human species, the climate crisis represents a massive challenge. It's a practical and a pedagogical challenge, but it's also a moral challenge for educators and for individuals within education systems, even if it is never made government policy or institutional priority. When I first began thinking about the educational demands made by global warming and biodiversity loss, I understood the climate emergency as an unprecedented challenge for educators. A looming catastrophe, a term described by the philosopher Joshua Fortenza as a fundamental disruption of what was, up until that point, presumed to be a steady relationship between past, present, and future. Its etymological meaning, he tells us, is neither positive nor negative. It's merely the abrupt and fundamental change in a given situation. But now, when we speak of catastrophe, we mean a sudden, dramatic, and often traumatic turn for the worst. Certainly, this emergency threatens our very survival. And as the 2020s came into view for me, it seemed uniquely, or at least especially, threatening in that respect. But when I gave a talk on this topic at an event defending the value of philosophy in schools in late 2019, one audience member reminded me that in his childhood, the crisis of the moment had been the Cold War and the grave threat of nuclear annihilation. As I spoke at that event last winter, we now believe that COVID-19 was already circulating in Wuhan. And of course, I didn't know it then, but another sudden, dramatic and traumatic turn for the worst was just around the corner, and its implications for educators were enormous. The Cold War, the climate crisis, the novel coronavirus pandemic. It occurred to me that while they may differ in magnitude or in probability of loss, they remind us that crises are inevitable. We live in the shadow of catastrophe, either as trauma caused by events past or in fear of those to come. If this is a fact of life, then to what extent is our education equipping us to face up to it? The question then for educators, which is put succinctly by the philosopher of education David Aldridge, is this: what would education look like if it was designed to prepare people to face the existential threats in their future? The threat of a worst case scenario or a best case scenario, but also other threats and uncertainties, from an AI singularity to a global pandemic. From wherever we stand on the aims of education, there are plenty of unanswerable questions in the face of a crisis. What knowledge will be valuable, useful, or relevant in this new reality? What kinds of characters will fare well or even flourish? Will democracies evolve? Will they survive? What, if anything, can we reasonably assume about the world of work? Now, even in the fog of uncertainty, we can still make some educated guesses about what crisis-ready education might involve. And I think our written on the back of a fag packet answer might start out with some of the theoretical and practical knowledge we acquire through the study of science, technology, engineering, and maths, STEM. An understanding of the mechanisms of global heating and the delicate balance of various ecosystems seems relevant, right? And so does basic competence in statistics, so we might appreciate scale and risk. There could also be arguments made for some basic know-how of survival, how to grow food, how to mend machines, how to swim in open water. All of this sounds perfectly reasonable. And of course, a lot of this is stuff that we teach young people one way or another anyway. But clearly the curriculum can't expand infinitely to include everything that anyone thinks is important. Facing a crisis certainly helps focus on the most essential features of education. Essential in this narrow sense of ensuring survival, but also in this broader sense of ensuring that we thrive, whatever the future holds. So this is what might be counterintuitive. That my argument defends the fundamental of teaching philosophy in a time of crisis, because, let's be realistic, philosophy has not even made it into our existing curriculum. It's regarded as an optional extra, a luxury, even an irrelevance by many. Well, I think it should make the cut. My argument doesn't seek to undermine the fact that these kind of situations are going to require an education that equips young people to deal with complex scientific information, and perhaps some of the technical skills to respond scientifically or technologically too. I simply want to highlight that just like the Cold War, the ongoing climate crisis and the current pandemic present students with profound philosophical questions about what we value, what this means, and what we ought to do about it. And even if there was mass comprehension and acceptance of all the scientific facts about the climate and ecological disaster, for example, or the pandemic, the thorny questions of how to live well in light of them would still remain. These are questions like, is it ever okay to be selfish? Can children change the world, and should they have to? Does nature have any value besides its worth to humans? Is it sometimes rational to abandon hope? Are some lives worth more than others? What's wrong with extinction? Should today's children have children of their own? Can we save the planet and treat people fairly at the same time? But the utility of philosophy is not merely in the supply of educational content in the form of these kinds of questions. Its primary educational contribution is in its accessible, transferable, and indispensable educational methodology that it offers. It's a way of thinking, a way of tackling problems. The status of these kinds of questions has been massively diminished in recent years, with the narrowing of the curriculum caused, in my view, by an overemphasis on theoretical knowledge, particularly knowledge derived from STEM, areas of inquiry which are routinely and unwisely elevated above the arts and humanities. And incidentally, these are aspects of education that can be tested, rewarded, and ranked. Yet this comes at a time when the importance of these questions and the methods required to answer them has never ever been greater. I attended several school strikes in my hometown in Sheffield last year, and I began to suspect that I was witnessing firsthand the consequences of our educational system's overemphasis on theoretical knowledge and creeping scientism. I was worried that this might ultimately impede young people in their mission to realise a better future. I watched children in Sheffield who were still at primary school deliver powerful speeches imploring those with power to act to do so. I was impressed by their grasp of science and struck by the way that they cited research and reported statistics. Yet despite the fact that they faced the formidable job of defending their values in public in order to represent, motivate, persuade others, a job that's inherently philosophical, their ethical arguments were, for the most part, implicit. The scientific evidence was the centerpiece of almost every address. It was as though the data was all their case required. They implored us to listen to the science. Many in the crowd held placards that said things like, "Science, not silence." Quite curious, after the strikes, I rewatched several Greta Thunberg speeches online, and there I found plenty of rhetorically powerful language, genuine emotion, moral indignation, and a powerful sense of a passionate ethical commitment to her cause. But explicit ethical argument seemed to me to be downplayed in favour of loading the speeches with detailed scientific information. Thunberg herself regularly extols her audience to listen to the scientists, to unite behind the science. Science is the beating heart of her argument. I've got massive respect and gratitude for climate activists, especially the youngest ones, but I worry that a strange assumption lies behind this kind of discourse. The assumption that discussion around the climate and ecological crisis and other crises like the pandemic is fundamentally an empirical matter, which should be settled by merely letting science speak. But this is a mistake, because there are clearly some matters on which science cannot speak. Science can't pronounce on what will be prudent, virtuous, obligatory, or supererogatory. It can't tell us how to live a meaningful life, or what is good for us or for others. Science can't tell us how these goods are justly distributed throughout society, nor what forms of society are best. Now, you might reasonably assume that climate activists might be reluctant to infuse their talk with too much overt moral language about what is good, right, just, etc., since if the scientific evidence, for which there is overwhelming consensus, is routinely denied or ignored, moral arguments will be even more vulnerable to the charge that they are subjective, merely a matter of opinion, impossible to substantiate. As the situation stands, I think this is totally understandable. It's common for the powerful, it's common for powerful people in public office to characterize serious situations only in scientific terms. In the past few months or so the Independent newspaper reports, every single senior member of the government has stood at the same lectern in 10 Downing Street, and when asked to explain why the UK appears to be doing things differently to every other comparable country, has replied with the same 4 words, that we have been led by the science. The climate crisis is a predicament that can be spelled out in degrees of warming, in rising sea level, and numbers of animals or people displaced. The pandemic too can be understood in terms of the R rate. A good day is one in which only a few hundred people die. I think understanding the challenges that we face through the lens of STEM is understandable, and through the lens of STEM only is understandable. It's understandable, right, but it's not justifiable. Because these are also crises in value and meaning, and here, whether it's personal, interpersonal, political, science is just not in its element. We need the arts and humanities in general, and we need philosophy in particular. And the more we characterise these issues in only scientific terms, the more we obscure their rich philosophical and in particular ethical dimension. In doing so, we're de-skilling ourselves. We are failing to adequately educate the next generation. But what can explain this curious relegation of the philosophical dimension of human knowledge and understanding, specifically ethical reasoning, deliberation and judgment? Why has there been an attempt, in the words of my colleague Melanie Challenger, to drain the ethics from the conversations that concern us all? My tentative explanation is that government officials and children who take part in climate strikes alike come from a culture in which philosophical education is unjustifiably absent. Consequently, they lack the experience of philosophizing that would reveal its epistemological and ethical value, and at the same time equip them with the very skills they need to publicly defend that value and to assure that others get to benefit from it in future generations. In ordinary times, this is a shame, but in the current situation, and with existential threats on the horizon, it's a scandal. While we know little about what lies ahead, we can be fairly confident that young people face a future in which they must weigh complex considerations and determine which goals ought to be valued and which sacrifices made. They must interrogate what we mean by justice across countries, species, economies, and generations. They must work out how to survive and how to thrive in the face of profound existential threat. And to do this requires the careful thinking that philosophy cultivates. In the face of the climate crisis and the current pandemic, Both the theoretical knowledge and practical know-how afforded to us by science, technology, engineering, and maths is indispensable. But without the wisdom to know what to do in the face of this hurricane of corroborating and conflicting information, we're not adequately educating our children to face the future. Thanks very much.